Welcome, everybody. I'm Howard Louthan, Associate Chair in the History Department, and though I will not introduce our speaker, I'd like just to welcome everybody to our talk this evening. I have been asked, the History Department is very proud to be one of the co-sponsors of Professor Carp's talk today, and I've been asked to highlight a little bit one way in which the History Department has contributed to enrich the world of the humanities here at UF. And I'd like to just briefly say a few words about a very successful honors program. Our honors program is now in our fifth year, and it's done very well, sort of beyond the expectations of many of us. We work with undergraduates for, in most cases, for the course of 3 semesters. We help them identify topics around which they put together an honors thesis. We help them locate funds. Many of these students go abroad or do research here in the United States. I think at last count, we've had students doing research on 5 continents. We have a common fall seminar where students come together and work through the early stages of putting together a thesis. And then in the spring, we pack out this room, very similar to what's happened today, with a spring honors conference where students present their work. Their parents come into town. Last year we had a group of about 120 for our spring honors luncheon. As I said before, this program is now in its 5th year and is thriving. We have 35 students this year who are involved in the program. Our alumni have gone on to professional and graduate programs in various disciplines, schools like Harvard, Princeton, Yale, UCLA, Northwestern, abroad, both Cambridge and Oxford. We have our alumni there. I should say as well that we're looking forward to the future. We've got a great crew of students coming on for the future, and the appeal of the honors program has been across disciplines as well. We've had students not only from the history department, obviously, but we've had students from political science, English, religion, and we've even appealed to students outside the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences altogether. We had a marvelous student last year from the the College of Journalism come and put together a documentary. So the history department is sort of moving into the 21st century as well as we move beyond the printed word and look at other media too. So without any further ado, let me turn things over to Professor Sean Adams.
Thanks. My name is Sean Adams, and I am the acting director of UF's Center for Humanities in the Public Sphere. I'm also a member of the Department of History. Y'all are getting a full dose of historians tonight, 3 in a row. I see some of my students here, and I'm really pleased to see them at this talk, and I'd like to welcome them and the general audience to you here tonight to remind you that this talk is the 3rd, actually, in a series that the Center is sponsoring entitled Civil Society on the Future Prospects of Meaningful Dialogue. Now, the first 3, of which tonight's talk is the kind of capstone, will deal with social fragmentation. And the final 3 that will begin in the spring semester will address how we open new spaces for dialogue. So we're tearing civil society down, and then we're going to build it back up by the end of the year. So please look for our posters. We have some over there. Visit us at our website or sign in at the sign-up sheet to be on our email list, and you can hear more about the series in general and some of our future speakers. It's also my job and my honor to thank our generous co-sponsors tonight, who include the UF Office of Sustainability, the Honors Program, the Department of English, the Sam Proctor Oral History Project, and of course, the History Department that Dr. Howard Louthan just represented. These sponsors make our series work, and we're really grateful that they can be a part of this collaborative venture. I'd also like to thank the Associate Director of the Center, Dr. Sophia Ackard, our assistants, Megan Leroy and Sarah Harms, for their work in making this talk possible. Phoebe Wilson at the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences helped with the publicity for these talks, and of course we always like to give a shout out to the people that make the checks happen. So we'd like to thank the Office of Shared Services at class as well. And we'd like to invite you to join the discussion tonight by reserving your questions for the Q&A session, which will come at the end of the talk. But if you would like to join us on Twitter, we ask that you use the hashtag UF Civil Society, and that's all one word. And the mention of electronic medium is, of course, your opportunity to silence all of those cell phones and alarms that you might have for the next hour or so. Okay, so that's the administrative business, and what I'd like to do is introduce our speaker, and tonight we have a session planned that's very important to me in two ways. First, as a historian of the United States, it's nice to introduce a colleague who also works in the early American Republic. So for those of you that have those questions about Thomas Jefferson and the embargo of 1807, you're well in luck tonight, as well as the Tea Party. We're a kind of small but proud breed among U.S. historians working in the early Republic. The second reason I'm particularly excited is, as an American, which I share with most of you here tonight. I don't share the historian identity, but I share the American identity. I came to realize after reading our speaker's recent book that the Boston Tea Party, which he's going to talk about tonight, is a really complex event, much more complex than we thought, and it reflects both the international scope of the events that led to the American Revolution, as well as that particular event, the Tea Party's controversial and indeed contradictory impulses. And what I found interesting is that our speaker tonight refers to it in his book as both a, quote, formative expression of liberty, independence, and civil disobedience, but also, and this is a quote, downright frightening, in that it seems to justify the bullying nullification of any law that an outspoken group dislikes. So more than 2 centuries later, we're still struggling to figure out exactly what it means, even as it continues to resurface in American public life, and often in unanticipated and unexpected places. So many of us still feel a deep connection to these 18th century revolutionary American moments, and their meaning to us still resonates today. But I've spoken enough about why I'm excited about this talk. It's now time to introduce the speaker so you can see why I think that we're all in for a treat tonight. Dr. Benjamin Carp comes to us from Tufts University in Boston, where he is Associate Professor of History and teaches classes, an impressive range of classes, on the American colonial period in the Atlantic world, the Revolutionary period, the early Republic, antebellum America, the Civil War Reconstruction, along with more specialized courses that focus on the history of revolutionary Massachusetts, on early American cities, and on American military history before 1900. He is the author of Rebels Rising, Cities and the American Revolution from 2007, and more recently, Defiance of the Patriots, the Boston Tea Party and the Making of America, from which I just quoted, and which actually recently won the Society of the Cincinnati Cox Book Prize in 2013. Dr. Carp is currently at work on a number of short projects that reveal a really amazing breadth of historical research, a magazine article on 18th century wet nursing debates, a volume essay, essay in a volume on the sectional politics of Jefferson's 1807 embargo, an article on cosmopolitan and Quaker merchants in pre-revolutionary Charleston, South Carolina, and a piece on fear and the American Revolution that we discussed in a seminar earlier today. So in addition with his wide teaching interests, he also has a wide range of publishing interests. And for that reason, and without further delay, I'm very pleased to present to you Dr. Benjamin Carp.
Thank you, Dr. Adams, and thanks. Oh, I don't want to use this, do I? Right? Am I mic'd yet? Okay. Yeah, and thanks to everyone at UF for welcoming me and for the various sponsoring institutions. I guess we are gathered here today to tear civil society down. Let's see whether we're on board with that. So this talk is going to start by going backwards, because when we think of tea parties nowadays, unless you have young daughters or were one once, you know, the thing we mostly think about is the current Tea Party movement. But obviously this all originates with the Boston Tea Party of 1773, known to every schoolchild, but you know, now has this new place in public debates after the rise of the Tea Party movement in 2009. So by coincidence, because I signed the contract to write this book in 2005 or something, I wrote a book on the Boston Tea Party, and now I always get asked, how do the two compare, or how has studying 1773 changed my perspective on current events? And what I generally tell people is, whatever the merits are of the Tea Party movement, the idea of using Tea Party to invoke this historical event is nothing new, and it doesn't exclusively belong to the American right or even to Americans. Instead, the Boston Tea Party, in a way, belongs to our, by which I mean all of humanities, collective history, even a global history. And yet, like our own antagonistic views about contemporary public policy, any good historian will tell you that our history itself is a site of contest, a tempest of disagreement in a fractured teapot. So even though the Tea Party movement wears its history a little lightly sometimes, their appropriation of this historical event is still significant, and it points up some real parallels that are useful for our understanding of past and present. For instance, with both the American Revolution and the Tea Party movement of today, people have argued whether these were authentic popular movements or not. But how do we know? And if popular movements turn out to be manipulated and somehow fraudulent, does that make them inauthentic? Does that affect how we regard them? People appropriate different historical events in different ways. They can exaggerate, they can distort, they can pick and choose what we remember, which can shape public debate in future generations and can echo throughout civil society. The Boston Tea Party, which seems so simple that we should all be able to agree on its origins, its meanings, and its effects, has been invoked throughout the years by the right and by the left, by Americans and by non-Americans, and it's irresistible to us for several reasons. We're attracted to the Boston Tea Party, one, because of the attendant tactics involved, right? This is why every schoolchild gets excited about the Tea Party, right? It's dumping, chopping open crates of tea and throwing it all in the ocean, right? What better way? It's like every kid who's ever knocked over his brother's blocks or something knows that joy of destruction. There's a great short story by Graham Greene called "The Destroyers" about this group of almost feral children in bombed-out post-World War II London, and just they tear down a whole guy's house. Super interesting, right? Right. So any invocation of the Boston Tea Party is going to be redolent of that impulse, right? So the attendant tactics of boycotting tea, the secrecy that was involved in the Tea Party itself, the Indian disguises, the idea that this might have been an expression of nonviolent disobedience, the ostentatious property destruction, right? All of it is the kind of thing that we might want to, that we might find exciting and something that we might want to compare ourselves to. Also, the lawlessness, for better or worse, is why we often refer to the Tea Party, right? One way we could say this was lawless, this was a disruption of law and order, but the other way, the more positive way of looking at it is the Boston Tea Party was an expression of principle and an elevation of principle over mere obedience to the law, right? So sometimes there is a higher law or a natural law that you want to refer to, like no taxation without representation, and so that's when you have to suddenly break the law and destroy property in order to take these matters into your own hands. So that's another reason why the Tea Party is constantly a reference point for us. Third, the Tea Party looks like an anti-tax protest. And so we'll get to this in a second, but various tax protesters over the years have said, the Tea Party, those are our guys, right? They were out there fighting the good fight on behalf of keeping our money for ourselves, right? It's more complicated than that, but we'll get to that in a second. And finally, the Boston Tea Party as part of our story of national origins, right? To say that you are invoking the memory of the Boston Tea Party aligns you with all of our most sacred secular civic traditions, right? By saying, oh yes, we are a new Tea Party, or a new Tea Party is a borning, is to say we are associating ourselves with the sanctified founding fathers, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one other reason why we might make reference to the Tea Party. So on the surface, this all sounds like what the Tea Party movement is doing nowadays, but there are actually diverse examples throughout history. And I'll go through a list that I accumulated during my research. So as early as 1824, there was a protest against the federal tariff, which called for a boycott, quote, as was done in the Boston Tea Affair. In the 1830s, the labor leader Seth Luther defended himself against the accusation that labor unions were dangerous combinations by saying, weren't the disguised Bostonians a combination when they dumped tea into the harbor? Right? So he's trying to say, hey, the Boston Tea Party was an example of civil society just like labor unions are, but the courts didn't see it that way. In 1833, the Pequot Methodist minister William Apess and a few others were arrested for preventing white men from taking wood off of Mashpee lands, and their lawyer compared the Mashpee revolt to the Boston Tea Party. The Tea Party is also invoked against landlords in New York, against banks, so it was often used as a critique of powerful economic interests. In 1849, the Sons of Temperance urged members to, quote, throw the cargoes of king alcohol overboard. And Abraham Lincoln later defended some female clients who got together and destroyed a saloon in Illinois in 1854. But then on the other hand, during Prohibition, William Randolph Hearst says we need a Boston Tea Party against Prohibition itself. So whether you're wet or you're dry, you might be able to find some justification for your protest against the laws of the land in the Boston Tea Party. In 1873, the centennial, women's suffrage advocates used this anniversary to complain about their own taxation without representation. By the 20th century, women's suffragists were advocating boycotts and even property destruction as a way of getting their point across. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. offered the Boston Tea Party as an example of civil disobedience in his letter from a Birmingham jail, and 3 years later, Robert F. Williams used it as a rallying cry for more violent action on behalf of African American civil rights. Burn, baby, burn, he said. In 1915, the anti-Semitic Knights of Mary Phagan justified the killing of Leo Frank near Marietta, Georgia, by citing the Boston Tea Party as precedent. In the 1920s, William Joseph Simmons of Alabama, who was a KKK imperial wizard, read back into history to the Boston Tea Party and said that they were animated by the Ku Klux spirit. And when Salt Lake City tried to outlaw masked assemblies, a Klan representative protested that Klansmen were patriots, just as the Bostonians had donned masks to deliver their country from oppressors. Right? So civil society can be a place where African Americans argue for civil rights, but it can also be a place that defends racial discrimination. Since almost no one was seriously hurt at the Tea Party, or so we think, I'll get to that in a second, it also appeals to the advocates of a grand global tradition of nonviolent civil disobedience. When the British government in South Africa forced the South Asian Indians resident there to be registered and fingerprinted, Gandhi led the Indian community there to burn their registration cards in 1908 in protest, and a Daily Mail correspondent later compared this action to the Boston Tea Party. When Sun Yat-sen of the Kuomintang threatened to seize customs revenues at Canton in late 1923, and the United States sent warships to intervene, he sent a cable to Americans just after the anniversary of the Tea Party saying, "We must stop that money from going to Beijing to buy arms to kill us, just as your forefathers stopped taxation going to English coffers by throwing English tea into Boston Harbor." Since the 1970s, we mostly associate the Tea Party with tax protests. In 1988, a Detroit radio talk show host launched a campaign to send tea bags to Washington, D.C. to protest a pay raise for congressmen and senior federal employees. On April 16, 1990, which was tax day of that year, 3 libertarians drove a firebomb to a post office in Royal Oak, Michigan, wrapped it in a tea bag, addressed it to the IRS, and put it in a mail bin, which ended up injuring a postal worker quite seriously. In 1997, 2 congressmen dumped copies of the federal tax code in Boston Harbor. And there are countless other examples like this. But again, this is not exclusive, even in recent years, this is not exclusive to tax protests. In September 2001, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the Animal Liberation Front set a $1 million fire at a primate lab in New Mexico. And then in the following January, the Earth Liberation Front set a University of Minnesota genetics lab on fire. The response, of course, was that this was called eco-terrorism by corporate groups, by the FBI, by members of Congress, by conservative commentators. To counter this, the ALF spokesman, David Barbarash, asked rhetorically, I mean, what was the Boston Tea Party if not a massive act of property destruction? Property damage, he said, is a legitimate political tool called economic sabotage, and it's meant to attack businesses and corporations who are profiting from the exploitation and murder and torture of either humans or animals or the planet. To call those acts terrorism is ludicrous. Now, for the most part, we think of the Boston Tea Party as a distant, gauzy event, as heroic, patriotic, and revolutionary, but it's important for us to remember a few facts. First, although the political movement against British imperial control was built on the institutions of civil society, In the end, the Boston Tea Party itself was also uncivil. It was destructive, and it was potentially anarchic, which is a difficult principle upon which to build civil society. Softer imitations of the Tea Party that kind of just invoke the non-crazy part are a little bit misleading, in fact, whereas the people who follow the Boston Tea Party to its logical conclusions tend to be known as radicals to people in the mainstream. So it creates an actually quite difficult problem for us. Despite this, ironically, the proponents of the destruction of the tea were not, at that time, seeking the overthrow of British government. People think that Sam Adams had this planned out all along, but I'll explain why that's wrong. Furthermore, although many people think that the Boston Tea Party galvanized resistance against Great Britain, people thought it was so crazy and such an enormous act that they all joined hands and revolted against the British. That's not true. It's the British response, the passage of the Coercive Acts in 1774, that actually mobilized a broad swath of Americans and led to the dismantling of British rule in America and the meeting of the First Continental Congress, and eventually to Lexington and Concord and so on. The origins, even of the name, the Boston Tea Party, date not to 1773, when it was just called the destruction of the tea in Boston Harbor, but actually to the 1820s or 1830s, 50 years later, when the phrase was first used. In fact, it took 50 years for more than only a handful of men to even come forward about having participated in the Boston Tea Party. Now, why is that? Well, first, it was supposed to be a secret. They had gathered together and said, all right, we're going to do this. Don't tell anyone. We're all not going to get in trouble if we can keep the secret. And then they never gathered together again. So a lot of these men took this secret to their deathbeds. James Fenimore Cooper, in a history book that he wrote that the participants were scared of being sued by the East India Company even long after independence, right? So they weren't necessarily afraid of criminal prosecution because they weren't part of the British Empire anymore, but they were afraid that the East India Company, which was a private company, would sue them for damages if they stepped forward and said, hey, I was one of the guys who destroyed this tea, which, by the way, a ton of tea was worth about the cost of Paul Revere's house in the north end of Boston, and 46 tons of tea were dumped into the harbor. So 46 times the value of real estate in central Boston. That gives you an idea of how much in damages we're talking about. Finally, once the revolution was over, many people were yearning for law and order and saw the Tea Party as too violent and disorderly. It's worth remembering that in the weeks leading up to the Boston Tea Party, the townspeople had harassed and threatened and thrown rocks at the merchants who were appointed to receive the tea They attacked them at their homes and places of business until they were forced to leave town and take shelter on Castle Island in Boston Harbor. Even John Adams, who was as conservative as they came among the revolutionaries, said that it would only take a few carcasses to remove the causes of all our calamities. And by carcasses, he meant like the governor and people like that. The tarring and feathering of the customs informer John Malcolm came a few weeks after the Boston Tea Party. So even though not really anyone was hurt at the Boston Tea Party, it's occurring in this climate of violence and threats of violence. William Tudor, 50 years later, writes a biography of James Otis, and he writes that the meetings about the tea were, in fact, only an orderly, well-regulated mob. Their irregular action was salutary and indispensable at the time, but the habit of interfering in this manner with public affairs was a dangerous one. So this is a dangerous precedent, and it proves the virtue of the people that it did not produce permanent evils. Harriet Hanson Robinson, who was famous in her own right, but she was the grandchild of a Tea Party participant, she wrote that her mother always thought that the Tea Party was something disgraceful and to be kept hidden from all but the family, as if it was some riot, and that those engaged in it were liable to suffer from it. So again, there's something, but even from the people who lived through it and participated in it, there was something shameful about that. And the kind of elites of society in the 1820s were like, well, maybe they had to do that in those days, but that's definitely not a precedent that we want to hold on to now, because the idea of mobs taking matters into their own hands, that's not something that that's not a legacy that we want people to follow. So, even at first, many Americans were shocked by the Boston Tea Party and thought it was a bad idea. Benjamin Franklin, who was a London agent for Massachusetts, initially urged Boston's leaders to repay the East India Company for the damaged tea. Parliament had the same idea. In 1774, George Washington was outraged by Parliament's coercive acts, which were punishment for the Tea Party, but he hastened to add that he disapproved of the destruction of the tea itself. So even at the moment when the Tea Party happened, it's not necessarily enshrined as a pillar of great American deeds. European and some American observers during the long 8-year war that followed Lexington and Concord often reflected in amazement that something as familiar and trivial as tea could start what almost became another world war. And yet it did. And one question that historians have always asked is, why did this happen? If you asked most Americans in 1763 about their allegiances, they would have declared themselves proud subjects of the king and denizens of the British Empire. They would have gloried in their recent defeat of the French. They would have proclaimed their pride in their English liberties. And they would have been considered themselves addicted to British culture, not least of all tea. We think of the American Revolution as belonging to our shared national heritage, and so we might believe that Americans always thought of themselves as Americans. But not only is that incorrect, but there are all sorts of ways that we can argue about the motivations of the Americans during the Revolutionary era. So how did a popular movement lead these proud British citizens of the British Empire out of the British Empire? Was the revolution an authentic popular political movement or not? And what role did civil society play in this political movement? Interpretations of the American Revolution often barrel into one of two pitfalls, both of which dangerously misinterpret or exaggerate the workings of history and contemporary politics. The first is to adhere narrowly to a traditional, what historians call Whiggish narrative, suggesting that the American revolutionaries were united against the British, irrespective of their social divisions, in their righteous, high-minded ideals of liberty. This is the narrative that we learn as children from shallow textbooks, from the Pledge of Allegiance, and it's still promoted today by those who yearn for a collective history. These narratives of the revolution tend to rely on self-congratulatory accounts from the patriot side. And under this narrative, we observe Americans achieving a consensus, marching hand in hand from the Stamp Act to the crisis, to the Declaration of Independence, to the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and always putting their internal conflicts aside, right? That was the narrative that the patriots of the time told about themselves, and it's still the narrative that patriots tell about this period today. But there's a second mistake, which is to assume that the American revolutionaries were motivated solely by the materialism and greed of national leaders, of slaveholders, merchants, and financiers. Like the history teacher in the movie Dazed and Confused, who reminds her student that as the bicentennial approaches, to remember that this country was founded by a bunch of slave-owning aristocratic white males who didn't want to pay their taxes. This is what I call the puppet master narrative. The narrative that many people adopt as teenagers or sometimes college students from a kind of hack revisionism or from a cynical skepticism that expects to find a conspiracy under every rock and thinks of the revolution as that kind of conspiracy. Under this narrative, wherever we see ordinary folks at work, they are, in the words of loyalist Peter Oliver, like the mobility, by which he meant the mob, of all countries, perfect machines, wound up by hand, by any hand who might first take the winch. So in other words, any puppet master could come along and inspire these people to do whatever they want. In other words, elite puppet masters and propagandists, the people who had patronage, who had influence, who had deep pockets, the kind of people that ordinary people would defer to and tip their hats to in the street, people like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, these guys were manipulating the ordinary good subjects of Boston. These narratives tend to rely heavily on loyalist sources, which were at the time panicked, snobbish, resentful, and begging the British for help. So, for instance, General Thomas Gage writes about the Stamp Act protesters in New York City in 1765. The plan of the people of property, the leading Sons of Liberty, has been to raise the lower class in order to prevent the execution of the law. And if it hadn't been for the influence and instigation of these people, the merchants, the assemblymen, the magistrates, etc., the inferior people, he said, would have been quiet. Now, both of these interpretations have some errors in common. Both of them deny the agency of ordinary people to make their own decisions about politics. Both of them have difficulty explaining how people with different interests mobilized to work together against Great Britain. According to consensus interpretations, the first interpretations, the colonists directed their anger only at the British and their loyalist stooges in stirring protests or recognized military confrontations. These narratives play down incidents such as land riots, the regulator movements of the Western farmers, Indian warfare, urban unrest, and slave revolts, which offer a more complicated picture. According to the materialist puppet master interpretation, local anger and unrest was the product of manipulative elite leaders who hoped to intimidate their neighbors and consolidate their power, particularly their power to avoid imperial taxes and regulation. Now, today, both of these incorrect narratives are reflected in our contemporary debates. people who talk about the current Tea Party movement and other elements of the right wing, people who are from the Tea Party movement and other elements of the right wing, talk as if historical revisionism is a kind of curse word. And they're uninterested in the divisions and conflicts among the revolutionary generation. They just want to say the Constitution is holy writ and we should all follow it. Similarly, the Tea Party people believe themselves to be a grassroots movement, blissfully free of any uncomfortable social divisions. They believe themselves to be the real Americans, and since they're in something of an ideological echo chamber a lot of the time, they have very little patience for alternative views. Now, this is understandable to some extent. They want to act as if they have a coalition that either represents the will of a vast majority or a kind of heroic, beleaguered minority. But either way, they think of themselves as having a kind of monopoly on patriotism. They're willing to use quotations from the founding generation, both real and fake, at every turn. And of course, it's historians' job to kind of call them to account about this. But as critical thinkers, all of us should remember that in the public sphere, patriotism is often the last refuge of scoundrels. Even if we ourselves feel ourselves to be patriotic and loyal to our country, there's nothing more distasteful than your opponent wrapping himself or herself in the American flag to dismiss your arguments. That way lies, my country right or wrong, or the Alien and Sedition Acts, nativism, Red Scares, McCarthyism, and any kind of suppression of dissent. That's not the kind of civil society that I think we want. However, critics of the Tea Party also make a mistake in looking for the hidden astroturf beneath this so-called grassroots movement. They accuse it of being funded by the Koch brothers and other shadowy conservative groups. They suspect the movement of delusion, gullibility, stupidity, racism, and violence. They'll accuse the Tea Partiers of going beyond constitutional originalism to historical fundamentalism. That's a phrase used by Jill Lepore in her book. And some writers have begun to project these divisions, these delusions onto the 18th century revolutionaries themselves, right? And kind of say, well, they too must have been wound up by a winch by rich elites who were out for their own interests. So are these critics right? Well, let me tell you a story of 1773, and let me know if any of it sounds familiar to any of you, having experienced the last 5 years yourself. In 1773, the British government was deeply in debt due to recent global wars and expensive and expensive foreign ventures. Reckless financial speculation and a credit crunch had led to a global recession. The government deemed one of its largest corporations too big to fail and passed bailout legislation, including tax breaks. Ordinary people reacted not necessarily because higher taxes themselves were anathema, but because they worried that government favoritism towards big business would lead to higher taxes on ordinary Americans down the road. Local leaders organized protests against the government, even as they linked to one another via national networks and using the most modern forms of communication. Symbolism and showy costumes helped these images to stick in the public mind. And then critics questioned whether the Tea Partiers genuinely represented ordinary people, or whether, as I said before, these were self-interested rich guys who were propping up the protests. So that's a story of 1773 that ought to sound very familiar to us, having experienced the politics of the last 5 years. So given all this, how do we know whether the protests of past and present are disingenuous or real? Well, maybe we should just be so cynical as to say disingenuous is just the American way, whether we're talking about Hamilton or Jefferson or Jackson or Reagan or Obama or Kennedy or whoever, right? The mistake that we make, I think, is the kind of Thomas Frank, what's the matter with Kansas approach, by which educated liberals seize the populist conservative by his blue collar and say, don't you see, your material self-interest ought to compel you to vote for the Democrats, or maybe more in sadness than in anger, right? Forgive them, for they know not what they do. I think it's clear that mockery and condescension are not going to be the best ways for us to kind of join together in civil society and reach across the aisle, or at least understand a political movement whose aims might not agree with our own. So the question that I would ask is, how do we best understand popular movements and civil society in the 18th century? My own answer to that question in my research has been to study the mechanisms of political mobilization, to look at fire companies, or the Boston waterfront, or taverns, or churches, or the State House Yard in Philadelphia outside Independence Hall, or the households of Charleston, right? These were the building blocks of civil society, along with parades, spinning bees, voluntary associations like Masonic lodges or ethnic societies, the press, juries, and other institutions, right? In the 1960s and 70s, when historians first began talking about popular movements, and you can guess why the 1960s would have been a good time to start talking about popular movements, contemporaries were curious about the history of rioting, of popular mobilization, and of how politically legitimate they were. The historian Richard Ryerson laid out the elements of mobilization as he described them in his study of revolutionary Philadelphia. He said, what you see first is the development of a commitment to resistance by a few dedicated leaders. Then you see the creation of a new set of political institutions. This is the institutionalization, or what we sometimes know as civil society. Then you have the shaping and maintenance of a virtually unanimous popular commitment. And then you have the rapid recruitment of new leaders, both to perform new political tasks and to represent a greater proportion of the potentially active population than the population that had previously been able to find a voice before the revolution began. So those are the tools, he's getting this from political scientists and sociologists, by which leaders can harness commitment and bring in new leaders in order to sustain and institutionalize a popular movement. He begins and ends, if you'll note, by talking about local leadership. And this is the piece that I think historians often miss, partly because local leaders are sometimes harder to find. We know a lot about the Founding Fathers because they were nationalist state-making leaders. And we've speculated a lot about ordinary Americans, particularly when we've seen their actions embodied in town meetings or militia companies or parades or runaway statistics, the crowd, etc. We haven't paid nearly enough attention to the middlemen, right? The ones who translate sweeping national ideological arguments into the messy work of popular organizing, inspiring commitment, institutionalization, etc. Now, much later in his observations about the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville would notice cross-class voluntary associations emerging as a force for the tumultuous politics of the 19th century. But there wasn't a straight line between the Revolution and the 1830s, when most white males finally had achieved the right to vote. In between, Americans struggled over the meanings of democracy. The victorious national leaders who had drafted the Constitution and feared the French Revolution were either counter-revolutionary and conservative, as many historians have argued, because they worried that Shays' Rebellion indicated that civil society was coming apart. There was too much egalitarianism. And they wanted to hold on to civil society, whereas more leftward radicals wanted to continue the fight against the institutions that held people down. So, in the revolutionary era, you might have radicals like Thomas Paine railing against established churches. In the last 50 years, you might have the 60s radicals or the Occupy movement railing against Jim Crow or the patriarchal family or the Pentagon or big business, right? So there's two different approaches that you can take. You can either kind of say civil society will save us by keeping us all stitched together, or you can say, no, screw it. We've just got to get rid of all these institutions because they are helping the forces of oppression, keeping individuals and minorities down. Many theorists saw civil society as existing for the purpose of supporting a well-governed state, right? It was a realm of solidarity, held together by benevolence and affection. The civil society was not a place that was meant for the protection of individual rights because dissent was troubling. Even today, theorists who yearn for a return to civil society worry that too much emphasis on individualism and individual rights leads to atomization, polarization, and permanent fracturing. Maybe this is a good thing. Maybe we all need to learn how to live with social conflict, as Michael Walzer argues. And civil society can be good training for this, as long as it isn't too insular or too exclusionary. So given the various ways that civil society can interact with individuals, with communities, with the government, how does the Boston Tea Party fit in as an example of political mobilization? Well, first we need to know what motivated the Bostonians. So first is taxation without representation, right? The Tea Act actually didn't levy any new taxes. It actually was going to make tea cheaper, but patriots argued that this was a way to seduce Americans to paying an earlier tax, one that was passed in 1767, for which they hadn't given their consent. So that's the cause of the Boston Tea Party that we all know and love. The second is that the revenue from the Tea Act, from the Towns and Duties of 1767, were going to support the civil list, the governor, judges, other civil officials, which was going to take accountability away from the local popular assembly and give it to the British Treasury. Third, the Boston Tea Party propped up a monopoly company, the East India Company, which might lead to more monopolies down the road. So there were all sorts of ways that the British government and its pet company were going to pick your pockets. They'd keep levying taxes on you for which you hadn't given your consent, and they were going to foist monopoly companies on you that would be able to jack up prices and charge you whatever they wanted. The final cause of the Tea Party, I argue, actually, though, is also peer pressure from New York City and Philadelphia, which were actually worried that Boston was going to slip and allow the tea to land, which would undermine the entire intercolonial political movement against it. The second question we want to ask, if we're thinking about the Boston Tea Party as a popular movement, is who were the men? Well, we don't really know because they didn't come forward for 50 years, and you could say, oh, yeah, my dad was at the Tea Party, the way I could say, oh, yeah, my dad was at Woodstock. But no one was taking attendance at either of those places, so how do we know? So just so you know that I'm honest, my parents were both camp counselors, and they did try to go to Woodstock, but they only had 24 hours off, and so there was too much traffic, and they turned around, and so they missed out on the concert of their generation. So I'm actually willing to admit that my parents weren't there, but that is not something that people in the 19th century did. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry in the 19th century came forward and said, my dad was at the Boston Tea Party. But despite some of the sketchy evidence that we see with this, we can be pretty certain that this was a relatively young crowd. Most of them were between 18 to 29. They were all white men, mostly artisans, but with a smattering of local elites mixed in, and a few apprentices and laborers, some of whom were teenagers. A core of them had previous experience with political organizing in the North End Caucus, in the Freemasons, having signed political petitions, and some of them had participated in previous crowd actions, like the Boston Massacre. Their leaders, we assume, had connections to intercolonial networks like the Boston Committee of Correspondence, the Sons of Liberty, etc. So this is what we want to know. Were these ordinary apprentices and laborers and artisans pushed by these local leaders, or did the impetus somehow come from within? Now, and the evidence gives us both answers, right? So option A, we could look at the merchant Caleb Davis. He was a deacon of his church, a member of the Committee of Correspondence. He was a future Speaker of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, a member of civil society in good standing. In the 2 years preceding the Boston Tea Party, he employed 7 or 8 of the artisans who were later listed as Tea Party participants. One historian called the Tea Party men trustworthy persons who prepared in conformity to the secret resolves of the political leaders to act as circumstances should require. So what motivated them to follow their leader in this way? Was it deference to local community leaders like Caleb Davis? And if so, what can we learn from this about the way the 18th century mindset worked? Option B is, when a group of Yaleys met the caulker Samuel Howard as an old man, he remembered that a band of young men, including himself, had met in a cabinet maker's shop earlier in the day on December 16th to put on their disguises. But at that point, they hesitated to proceed and finally resolved to consult 2 or 3 influential men of the city. There's that deference again. But curiously, none of these influential men gave them any advice in either direction. None of them were willing to take responsibility for encouraging these artisans in what they were about to do. The furthest any of them were willing to go was to hint, if you go, you will find friends, wink, wink. So the young men in the cabinet maker's shop appointed a leader of their own, voted, and agreed to go ahead. In this scenario, the leaders communicated with ordinary artisans about why this was important, and those artisans still showed deference, but they didn't actually direct them. They weren't actually cranking the winch, as Peter Oliver said. Now, similarly, Theda Skocpol and Vanessa Williamson, in their study of the current Tea Party movement, find some of the most interesting things about the contemporary Tea Party movement in its local leadership. They say that the people who brought their civic experience in politics, in church, in Habitat for Humanity, in community theater, etc., they brought that experience to political organizing. They note that some of them were retired or sole proprietors of a business, or they were living on their spouse's salary, whether they were men or women. And that the structure of a successful Tea Party organization was leadership, commitment, and institutionalization, just as Ryerson said, right? Subcommittees with bylaws, communications flowing among all the different members, outreach and education, monitoring local officials and holding them to account, holding public rallies, right? They often do their own fundraising or have members pay dues. So there's real institutionalization going on there. It's not just haphazard lurching in every direction. These groups are not always translocal, right, the way organizations in civil society have been in the past, right? You have your national organization and then each state chapter and then the various local chapters. For much of American history, that's what civil society looks like. Instead, originally these really were local organizations that didn't necessarily have any direct connection to outside groups. And the national politicians, the impresarios, the grifters, and the partisan media often came later. Local and national groups used each other at that point for leverage. For instance, a local group needs a speaker in order to keep its members entertained, and a national group wants to get the message out, so boom, right? They can work together, but they're not necessarily really accountable to one another. That's why you read all these stories about the National Republican Party, not worrying about what the Tea Party movement is going to do, and vice versa, for sure. And so Williamson and Skocpol conclude that unlike educated liberals who are smart on public policy but weak on political process, which is why you read op-eds in the New York Times saying, oh, if only Obama could give a magical speech, he'd be able to like knock heads together and all our problems would be solved, right? That's the kind of thing that educated liberals will sometimes say. But whereas Tea Party grassroots people, they conclude, are strong on process. They know exactly how politics work and where to apply leverage, but they're kind of more in the echo chamber on policy and not necessarily accepting of outside ideas. So this gets at the crux of what we're asking. In a protest like the Boston Tea Party or the Tea Party movement, are local politicians merely angling for their own political advantage, their own local authority, their own economic interests? Are they charismatic true believers who are able to channel the will of their neighbors? Or are they personally swaying the ambivalent and the skeptical? Or are they standing aside and letting people claim the mantle of leadership for themselves? The answers to these questions are always going to be complicated, and the search for evidence is always going to be elusive, because people aren't going to be honest necessarily about their own motivations. But for scholars, that's what makes these questions so much fun. And for citizens, for all of us, figuring out the answers to these questions are the only way that we're going to be able to forge a healthy relationship between the civil society and the state and the individual. We take it as an article of faith ever since Montesquieu or Tocqueville that civil society is a good thing. David Potter once said, one fights for the joy of his pinochle club when he is said to fight for his country. In other words, America's most robust culture of churches, local courthouses and juries, synagogues, workplaces, saloons, barbershops, and voluntary associations are crucial not just for American nationalism and a robust civic culture, but they're the bulwark against two terrible nightmare alternatives, right? One is a highly centralized absolutist state, which is going to lead to state-sponsored repression, or a raging mob that will tear down property and invite anarchy and eventually lead to Thunderdome or a demagogic dictator or something like that. Civil society in this telling acts as a check on absolute power and the tyranny of the majority. But there are also good reasons to be distrustful of civil society. If you look at the Tea Party disruption of town meetings hosted by congressmen discussing health care in 2009, or cops pepper spraying students at UC Davis, or Brown University threatening to punish students over booing the New York City police commissioner off the stage over stop and frisk, right? Public squares, colleges, town meetings, all of them can have their civic function disrupted by uncivil free speech, but then the response can sometimes be worse than the disruption. Or take McCarthyism as an example, where it was not just Republican legislators who led the witch hunt against communism, but also these very local institutions that we celebrate: churches, synagogues, places of work, schools, labor unions, civic associations, which were demanding loyalty oaths, etc., and helping to support McCarthyite attempts to do away with communism, which later called a witch hunt by critics. Is this corruption of civil society an alien phenomenon, a product of what Richard Hofstadter called the paranoid style in American politics, an idea that also influenced Gordon Wood's interpretation of the causes of the American Revolution? Or is this idea that civil society and its local hierarchies can sometimes work in tandem with the state to suppress individual liberty, is that something that's inherent in liberal democracy? That's a very disturbing question. And how do we draw the line? And who's we? Who gets to draw the line? Certainly not university professors. Some historians of the American Revolution, including Pauline Maier and Barbara Clark Smith, have argued that the crowd itself was a civic institution in the 18th century, not the out-of-control violent mob that would plague the nightmares of Tocqueville or Edmund Burke, but an institution, albeit a lower-class institution, with its own traditions, rules, and limits, an institution that could fill in for the courts and sheriffs when they proved inadequate to the community's needs. As voters and jurors, ordinary people enforced norms within their local communities in their own way, even to the point of freeing convicts or tarring and feathering or preventing property seizures. Yet still, as Smith says, high financiers like Robert Morris helped destroy this culture and separated Americans into wealthy nationalist interests and the local interests of ordinary people. In such a scenario, nationalist leaders expected that civil society would only exist so as to support the nation and its creditworthiness. Thomas Hobbes thought that civil society ought to be based on the idea of fear of the state of nature, that we run to and obey our preachers and teachers and lords and kings because we know that being outside of civilization can lead to chaos and death. This sort of fear perhaps motivated the founding fathers who drafted and then protected the Constitution. They began to argue that social order, conversation, moderation, comity, quietism would help prevent the tyranny of the majority, radical movements, factions, and other things that they saw as nightmarish. This is Corey Robbins' argument in his book on fear, on political fear. The Boston Tea Party seems to fit somewhere in between Boston, but in between civil society and the crowd. The Bostonians called a town meeting. The first thing they did was they called a town meeting and attempted to get the tea returned to London legally. When that didn't work, they formed together as a technically illegal assemblage, but one that existed within an ancient tradition of Anglo-American political theory called the Body of the People. And this absolved the formal town government of responsibility, but still attempted to resolve the problem in a civil manner. They tried everything. They pressured the consignees and the owners of the ships that were carrying the tea. They worked in tandem with the crowd. They asked local customs officials and the governor to look the other way so the tea ships could be sent back. And then on December 16th, they had their answer. They couldn't send the tea back, and because of peer pressure from New York City and Philadelphia, they couldn't allow the tea to land, and so there was only one place left for the tea to go, and that was into the harbor. And when the Mohawks entered the Old South Meeting House, they intended to be seen as deliberately uncivil outsiders, scapegoats. That was the point of this disguise. Nobody really thought that these guys were Indians who had come from upstate New York, right? So that even the people of Boston couldn't be blamed for the property destruction that was about to take place. Nevertheless, this act seems to have been carefully controlled by leaders. And it was limited. They only destroyed the tea. They even replaced a padlock that they broke. Their only act of violence was against one of their own who violated their code by trying to steal tea for himself. And then they went home when they were done. They didn't commit any other violence against persons. So even so, as we saw, everyone from Washington on down to the participants themselves were nervous that the Tea Party had gone too far. Maybe we can't go back to an 18th century way of thinking, but this interplay between the crowd and civil society can still help us to understand popular political mobilization, both for good and for ill. What's good about civil society? Well, sometimes laws are oppressive or unequal. Sometimes people want to try to purge the voter rolls, and so we want to see movements for civil rights and suffrage, a more representative government, a press that's free to criticize the government, a robust political dialogue, vigilance against monopolies and other forms of corruption. We want to make sure that people have a sense of obligation towards one another. And in our fantasies, the small building blocks of local organizations are the way to do that. If the state is inadequate to these tasks, it's possible we might want organized groups of citizens to take to civil society in order to challenge the status quo. Failing that, more radical groups may decide that civil society itself is inadequate. And in a liberal democracy, that means taking the law into your own hands. And that's never something we should take lightly. The revolutionaries certainly didn't. They felt that they were using violence and destruction only as a last resort, and that they were using it in legitimate ways. Whether you're on the left or the right, if you're willing to give the people this sort of power, you have to be willing to grant it to your worst enemies as well. Because once things get to the level of property destruction and then to violence, to a discourse that privileges principle over law and order and accepted norms, then we get to a point where civil society actually breaks down, and perhaps more than tea is going to sink to the bottom of Boston Harbor. So how far did the Boston Tea Party go? Was it an action that crossed the line? That's not necessarily an easy question to answer, and that's something that the various groups who have drawn inspiration from the Boston Tea Party ought to consider as well. Thank you. What's that? I would be delighted to answer questions. Yes.
Agreed to take some questions that you all might have, so I'll moderate.
For the Boston Tea Party? We don't actually know. I mean, more than 400 names have come down to us in history. The list at the back of my book is about 100. I don't know how many guys you can fit on top of 3 merchant ships, in 2 to 3 hours. There's a lot of like, oh, my grandfather saw the Boston Tea Party, so he was a participant in the Boston Tea Party. So there's no way to know for sure. But about the number of guys that it would take to unload 340 chests of tea in 2 to 3 hours aboard 3 ships. But they made quick work of it, block and tackle, all that stuff.
What made a difference in regards to the violence of the French Revolution?
That's a very good question, and entire books have been devoted to that. The question was, what's the difference between the violence of the French Revolution and the violence of the American Revolution? I was discussing this with some students and faculty today at lunch. It comes down to us as Americans that the French Revolution kind of devolves into the terror and the mob and executing kings and queens and all this stuff, whereas the American Revolution was somehow a bit more conservative and a bit less violence. That's the way Americans like to draw that comparison. But I don't know. I think that the American Revolution was quite violent. It's just that because it's more spread out over this large continent, we don't always see it as that. And so, yeah, we don't see some of the exact same events, and you know, and certainly things at the Vendée get pretty brutal in terms of the Revolutionary Wars. But I think that the American Revolution gets off with a little bit of a light slap on the wrist, a little bit too much of a light slap on the wrist. I think it was quite violent in ways that we don't always appreciate. Again, because of this narrative that says, oh, we need to see it as this heroic story of origins. Nobody wants to argue with me about any of this stuff? Come on. Yeah.
The American identity, when do you think that became true for everyone?
Oh, that's a very good question. That was definitely the central concern of historians, has been the central concern of historians in a lot of different eras. You know, the 1950s, right, trying to kind of locate the American way in colonial society, up to the 1990s when kind of multiculturalism and identity politics was at the forefront of everyone's mind. People wanted to know what was it that constituted an American identity. I mean, I really think that civil society has something to do with the answer to that. It's only when you start establishing institutions like a Continental Congress or a Continental Army that all of a sudden ideas of distinctions between Virginians and people from Massachusetts start to break down, and there's a kind of level of fellow feeling as Americans. I mean, certainly the Declaration of Independence talks about the United States of America, right? And so at that point, I mean, I think that colonial Americans used to vaguely talk about American interest, but it was all a little vague, and it's like, where did America stop? Right, because East and West Florida there were 26 British colonies in the Western Hemisphere in 1776, and 13 revolted, right? So what about all the others, right? We're talking about the Caribbean islands, East and West Florida, and then, you know, all the provinces that are now Canada. So, right, so at what point does American identity become centered around those specific 13 colonies and then the lands west of them? That's obviously a process that gets worked out. So there's no easy answer to that. But, I mean, if you had to pin me down, I guess I would say 1776. Or maybe 75.
Do you think there's any significance to their playing Indian?
Oh, yes. I devoted an entire chapter to the idea of playing Indian. There's actually a very good book by Phil Deloria, whose father is a famous Indian activist. He teaches at the University of Michigan. He wrote a book called Playing Indian that looks at the various ways that whites have engaged in these kind of minstrel shows of dressing up in Indian disguises, whether as part of the Boy Scouts or hippies in the 1960s. But he starts with, for very obvious reasons, the Boston Tea Party. I tried to kind of move beyond that, but his basic thesis, which I think is still sound, is that the idea of white men dressing as Indians allows you to both say, we are not British, but we are also not native and therefore savage in their minds, right? That there's something in between, right? Something, the best of both worlds. They're Americans who are too free to be part of old Europe, but also civilized enough to elevate themselves above actual Native Americans. So that's what, in his mind, that's what those disguises say. I agree with all of that, and then found other things to say about the disguises as well. The disguises themselves are really, really interesting. I mean, you never get someone saying, this is why we dressed the way we did, but there's all sorts of kind of anthropological interpretive stuff that you can read out of those disguises and the way that Native Americans were portrayed in the 18th century that make the use of Native American disguises really, really interesting. I mean, the two things that I can always knock down is A, nobody thought they were real Indians, and B, I don't think anyone even thought that these were effective disguises. So keeping in mind that Boston is a town of 16,000 people, now, how does that compare to the size of the University of Florida, right? And now keeping in mind that less than a quarter of those would have been adult white men. So, right, and it was all adult white men who were basically boarding the ships. So, you know, you knew how your neighbor carried himself or how your cousin walked, right? Everybody knew who these guys were. But what the disguises were supposed to symbolize was, we're doing this on behalf of the community, and you'd better not rat on us. There was already precedent for this from the Gaspé incident in Rhode Island the year before, right? If you tried to prosecute these guys for treason or property destruction, you'd never be able to get a witness to tell on them. That's what those disguises were supposed to signify. But then there's all this other stuff about what it meant to take on the identity of an Indian for a white person in the 18th century. It's really, really interesting. But I think that in relation to the theme of these talks, civil society, it was a way of kind of saying we're a little bit dangerous, but we still think of ourselves as somehow representative of civil society. I'm giving a talk on this at the Old South Meeting House itself, actually, which still exists, on December 12th. So if any of you are in Boston.
If one of the leaders of the Boston Massacre, one of the martyrs of the Boston Massacre is a black man, Crispus Attucks.
Yes.
And if,
black and Indian.
And if some of the members of Boston's lower class are free blacks or enslaved African Americans, how can we be sure that everybody who goes on this ship is a white male?
Yeah, we can't. I mean, I just don't have any evidence that that any of them were black. Believe me, if I'd seen any evidence, I totally would have seized on it and researched it as much as I could, because I think that would have opened up even more fascinating possibilities. But it's quite possible, right? But there's no evidence, so I can't say it. One thing that's interesting and that I talk about in the book is after the Boston Massacre, right? John Adams, maybe if you've seen the HBO miniseries, you know this. John Adams defends the British soldiers, and the way that he does it is by saying, the guys who were throwing snowballs and rocks and bricks at the soldiers, that wasn't real Boston. That was saucy boys and Jack Tars and Irish Teagues and Negroes, right? So that was people who we don't really think of as being part of civil society. They were young guys, the Irish, sailors, and non-whites. That's who was throwing stuff at the British. So, and the reason why he's doing this is that his audience is partly British, right? He's still a patriot. He's still allied with all of the Sons of Liberty. He's still protesting against the Stamp Act and the Townsend Acts and everything else. But he has to be able to say to the British government, don't come down on us too hard because this wasn't really us, which is a very fine line that the Sons of Liberty in Boston are trying to walk. That's what they're trying to get away with. They're trying to get away with these mob actions, these crowd actions, that's the other guy. But when we come up with erudite protests against your laws, that's us. And somehow these two forces are working in tandem with one another, but again, no accountability to one another. Right? It's really interesting. So I don't think, right, so some people have looked at all that, like in progressive era biographies of Samuel Adams, and they've come to the puppet master interpretation that, Samuel Adams must have been manipulating these crowds into doing his bidding because his plan was to revolt from the British all along. But what I think is a more interesting possibility is that both lower class people and elites in Boston have their own reasons for protesting against British laws. They did it in their own way, and sometimes they were able to coordinate, and sometimes they acted at cross purposes to one another. But it's really interesting the way the elites both try to direct this and also have to kind of back away from it from time to time. It's a really interesting game. From a tactical perspective, it makes you wonder about the way some of our politics works nowadays too.
I know that you said that they were kind of ashamed during that time, but do you think, looking back, it was a morally justified event, dumping the Teapot? Do I think that? I don't. That's a really, no one's ever. I've given probably 4 dozen talks on the Boston Tea Party. No one's ever asked me whether I think it was morally justified. I mean, I think I'm not going to let myself be pinned down by that one. I mean, the thing is, that's not what they were trying to do, right? They really just wanted the tea to go back. Right, and so what they immediately said was, it's actually the governor's fault. If he hadn't been so stubborn and forced us to follow the law, all of this could have been avoided. Right, so even they think that it's morally not justified, except that they were left with no other choice. You know what I mean? So. Right, like what you're asking me is, do the ends justify the means? Was the creation of our great nation, does that justify any violent acts that came before it? Well, That kind of thing I think I wouldn't be comfortable saying, because of course our country has made mistakes and done horrible things, and maybe if we'd been Canada instead, we wouldn't have dropped the bomb on, you see what I mean? Like, you can play these games all day long. So yeah, I mean, I think that is a very, very, very tough question. But I congratulate you for asking it.
We like to put people on the spot.
Yeah. Turn the screws, sure. Good or bad? No equivocation. Yes, sir.
Was Jefferson as troubled as Washington was?
Jefferson's reaction specifically. He actually, so it's a year later after the Coercive Acts. So right after the Coercive Acts, Franklin and they're all changing their tunes. They're saying, how dare you come down on us this hard? Right, this is the other thing that makes it look like an American conspiracy, right? That they forced the British, they provoked the British as much as they could, and then when the British cracked down, they were like, how dare you? But Jefferson, in his summary view of the Americans, he says, this was totally justified. That this is what people who believe in liberty are sometimes forced to do. But I don't remember what he felt when he first. I think I looked for it. I don't remember what he said when he first heard the news. But by the time he's writing his influential pamphlets against Parliament in 1774, he's totally saying that the Tea Party was justified, if I'm remembering correctly. But that doesn't necessarily make Jefferson any different from Washington, although he was probably a bit more radically inclined than Washington. It's just the timing of the quotes that we're talking about. I mean, Washington too, even though he's saying, oh, I don't think the destruction of the tea was a good idea, he's kind of saying, well, the destruction of the tea wasn't a good idea, but how dare you, Parliament, right? Like, so he's kind of trying to meet them on the same moral plane. Like, yes, I agree with you that destroying tea is bad. However, disrupt the Boston Port Act and the Massachusetts Government Act and the Administration of Justice Act. That stuff's way worse. So they're all trying to kind of compete on this sphere, in the public sphere, for the moral high ground, and that's what some of these kind of criticisms of the Boston Tea Party are really about. But I also think that this kind of unease about the Boston Tea Party is genuine.
One more question we have time for.
I've heard that it's very comical that the fact that you try to get your opponent to go over the act or something, so it's justification for your own purposes. Do you think they were thinking that in that sophisticated a manner?
Yeah, of whether they're playing 11-dimensional chess or trying to kind of do a Reichstag fire or something like that. I wonder whether that's a learned tactic over time, right? That many of the examples that you might come up with would be more modern or contemporary, and something that. So I don't really know. I'm not enough of a kind of comparative historian to really know the answer to that question. I just think that the Americans, while they were coordinated, they weren't coordinated enough to say, this is the plan. You see what I mean? Or at least maybe we would see some evidence if that had been the case. Right? There's no central planning body for the revolt against Great Britain. They're too geographically scattered. And to the extent that there is correspondence among them, at least some of it survives, and we don't really see a lot of indication of that. I think that that's giving them a little too much credit, right? That's us applying our own hindsight back to them, where they can't see in the future of what the consequences of their actions are going to be. So I'm suspicious of that, and I think it's a... I think they really hoped that the British were just going to back down, because they had backed down by repealing the Stamp Act, by repealing all of the Townshend duties except for the duty on tea in 1770. I think that they just felt like the Republicans did about Obama, that he'd just keep backing down if they pushed far enough, right? So there's also a lot of precedent for people thinking that too, that they're not really going to be willing to press this case. They're not really going to want to take up arms against us, right? I think that they were playing chicken to a certain degree, but I really don't think they were deliberately trying to provoke an overreaction. They really did leave Parliament with no choice. Once the Tea Party had happened, Parliament can't just say, okay, we're sorry, we'll repeal the Tea Act, right? At that point, the crackdown kind of has to happen in a way. So, well, thanks for everyone. Those are great questions.